Good afternoon. Well, we're honoured here at Policy Exchange to have with us His Excellency Harsh Vardhan Shringla, India's Foreign Secretary. For those unfamiliar with India's nomenclature, Mr. Shringla is the equivalent of our Permanent Secretary of our Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office rather than our Foreign Secretary, Dominic Raab, although it is perhaps worth noting that Mr. Shringla's predecessor, S. Jaishankar, did of course switch from that former role to the latter and is now serving as India's Minister of External Affairs. Mr. Shringla assumed charge of India's diplomatic corps in January this year, capping a career that has seen him serve as Ambassador to the US, High Commissioner to Bangladesh, and Ambassador to Thailand. He comes to London on the back of visits to France and Germany, where he has spoken of the need for a free, open, and inclusive Indo-Pacific, of the firmness and maturity of India's approach to dealing with the worst crisis in decades along its border with China, and of the shared challenges of dealing with terrorism. Foreign Secretary Shringla, it is a great pleasure to welcome you here to Policy Exchange. We have a global audience listening and watching. Many will want to ask questions afterwards, and I do remind them to stick their electronic hands up. Foreign Secretary, over to you. We're delighted to have you with us and look forward very much to your remarks.
Lord Johnson of Marylebone, and thank you for the very kind introduction. Mr. Dean Godson, Director of Policy Exchange, High Commissioner Gayatri Kumar, friends. I'm delighted to be speaking here at Policy Exchange, and I'm extremely appreciative of the effort that has been made to accommodate me in the midst of pandemic restrictions. In such challenging times, we can rely only on true friends. At the Ministry of External Affairs in New Delhi and at the High Commission of India here in London, we count Policy Exchange as not just an institution of great intellectual weight, but also a very special friend. So thank you once again. Diplomats and public policy thinks have an attribute in common. We are both in the business of persuasion. This is doubly appropriate in the context of my talk today, which is titled India's Vision of the Indo-Pacific. I'm conscious that Policy Exchange has put together an international commission on the Indo-Pacific, led by Stephen Harper, former Prime Minister of Canada. It comprises several policy practitioners and scholars, including two from India. I have to admit they're both my friends. I'm also given to understand that with Policy Exchange's not inconsiderable influence in the city, the Commission's report could feed into government thinking and shape the United Kingdom's Indo-Pacific strategy. As such, as you and the Commission you have appointed attempt to guide British policymakers, through my speech, I hope to explain to you India's approach. To do so, I will focus on the where, why, how and which and who of our Indo-Pacific vision. In other words, where do we geographically place the Indo-Pacific? Why do we see the region as so crucial to global prosperity and security and to India's rise? How do we work in the region, and which institutions and platforms do we find most convenient? Who are our key partners? While an Indian maritime analyst is believed to have used the term as far back in the 1990s, Indo-Pacific is a fairly recent addition to the geopolitical lexicon. It has come into prominence in the past decade. India has used it in joint statements with a series of partner countries, including but not limited to the United States, Australia, France, Indonesia, Japan, and of course, the United Kingdom. It figures in our meetings with our ASEAN friends and has helped advance the Quad consultations. that our ministry has recently set up an Indo-Pacific division as well as an Oceania division and placed them under a senior diplomat is a sign of India's commitment to this critical geography. Yet, India has not just mainstreamed the expression Indo-Pacific. More substantially, it has encouraged others to perceive and define the region in its full extent. For India, the Indo-Pacific is that vast maritime space stretching from the west coast of North America to the eastern shores of Africa. One of our key interlocutors in the United States, when asked to define the geographical extent of the Indo-Pacific, says it extends from Hollywood to Bollywood. We like to believe that it extends a little further into the eastern littoral of Africa. Today, more and more countries are aligning the definition of the Indo-Pacific with ours. To understand India's Indo-Pacific vision, it is important to understand why we define it in the way we do and to the extent we do. During the Cold War, the Indo-Pacific was sliced and diced into different spheres of influence and military theaters and made subservient to bloc-think. To India, this made little sense. Whether it was the forces of nature, the monsoon winds, for instance, or our maritime and trading history, we found it impossible to see the Horn of Africa and the Western Indian Ocean on the one hand and the Straits of Malacca on the other as disconnected. For us, they have always been a seamless whole. There are many reasons for this. The first and most obvious is the Indian Peninsula, which thrusts into the Indian Ocean and gives us two magnificent coasts and near limitless maritime horizons to both our east and west. Monks and merchants, culture and cargo have traveled from India on those waters to our east, west and south. India's great religious traditions, such as Buddhism, spread far and wide in the Indo-Pacific. Some of the oldest and most impressive Hindu temples are found in Vietnam, remnants of the Cham kingdom. 1,000 years ago, India's greatest coastal empire, the Cholas, sent maritime expeditions and trading ships as far as Sumatra to ancient China, as well as to the Abbasid Empire in what is today Iraq. Another empire, the Pallavas, had a flourishing trade relationship with Southeast Asia. Seaborne trade with Africa and with the Gulf states have been constants of Indian economic life. These experiences are our past and our future. These experiences determine our concept of the Indo-Pacific. As a country with an intimate maritime history in the Indo-Pacific, the UK would surely appreciate this. In the 21st century, the interconnectedness of the Indo-Pacific is finally coming into full play. A motivating factor in the region's emergence as a driver of international trade and well-being. The Indo-Pacific ocean system carries an estimated 65% of world trade and contributes 60% of global GDP. 90% of India's international trade and travels on its waters. For us and for many others, the shift in the economic trajectory from the Atlantic to the Indo-Pacific has been highly consequential. The rise of China and the imperative for a global rebalancing have added to this mix. A rules-based international order is achievable only with a rules-based Indo-Pacific. India's Indo-Pacific strategy was enunciated by Prime Minister Narendra Modi in a speech in Singapore in 2018 as the Sagar Doctrine. In Sanskrit, among other Indian languages, the word Sagar means ocean. The Prime Minister used it as an acronym for security and growth for all in the region. This aspiration depends on securing end-to-end supply chains in the region, no disproportionate dependence on a single country, and ensuring prosperity for all stakeholder nations. An Indo-Pacific guided by norms and governed by rules, with freedom of navigation, open connectivity, and respect for the territorial integrity and sovereignty of all states is an article of faith for India. In 2019, at the East Asia Summit in Bangkok, Prime Minister Modi took the idea of Sagar further and announced the Indo-Pacific Oceans Initiative. Using this initiative, India plans to support the building of a rules-based regional architecture resting on several pillars. These are maritime security, maritime ecology, maritime resources, capacity building and resource sharing, disaster risk reduction and management, science, technology and academic cooperation, trade connectivity and maritime transport. India has acted on these principles through both thematic and geographical initiatives. We have sought to strengthen security and freedom of navigation in the Indo-Pacific by becoming a net security provider. For instance, in peacekeeping efforts or anti-piracy operations in the Gulf of Aden, sharing what we can in equipment, training and exercises, we have built relationships with partner countries across the region. In the past 6 years, India has provided coastal surveillance radar systems to half a dozen nations: Mauritius, Seychelles, Sri Lanka, Maldives, Myanmar and Bangladesh. All of these countries also use Indian patrol boats, as do Mozambique and Tanzania. Defense training programs have increased. Mobile training teams have been deputed to 11 countries, from Vietnam to South Africa, as well as in our immediate neighborhood. Located just outside New Delhi, the Indian Navy's Information Fusion Center for the Indian Ocean region has enhanced maritime domain awareness among partner countries. In the area of humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, India has not only built robust capacities, it has also established itself as an instinctive and unstinted early responder and a credible friend. Notable HADR missions in the Indo-Pacific in recent years have extended from Operation Rahat in Yemen in 2015, when India rescued and evacuated about 7,000 persons, including about 2,000 citizens of over 40 other countries. In responding to natural calamities like cyclones, from the eastern extremity of the Indo-Pacific in Sulawesi province in Indonesia in 2018 to the western extremity in responding to Cyclone Idai in Mozambique in 2019, Indian assistance and an Indian ship have never been far away. The Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, or the CDRI, co-founded by India and the United Kingdom in 2019, is a corollary to such efforts, along with the International Solar Alliance, another institution co-founded by India, to evangelize renewable and specifically solar energy. CDRI is intrinsic to India's regional and global commitments to taking on climate change. As the COVID-19 pandemic hit us earlier this year, India did what it could to support its friends. Rapid response medical teams were sent to countries as far away as Kuwait and the Maldives, and on their request, throughout the lockdown, food supply lines were kept alive for the Gulf nations, as well as the smaller island states such as Mauritius, Seychelles, Madagascar, and Comoros. India has also promoted and contributed to infrastructure, connectivity, economic projects, and supply chains in the region, always prioritizing the needs of the host community and the ethic of equity, environmental sustainability, and social viability. I would go to the extent of suggesting that we have pioneered progressive thinking on such issues. Reading Germany's recently released policy guidelines for the Indo-Pacific region, I was struck by the prescription, and I quote, "When developing connectivity, it is important to facilitate fair competition, to avoid over-dependence on the part of the recipient countries, and to ensure transparency and sustainability," unquote. These are exactly the principles India has been upholding, and I'm glad that others are sharing our prism. We must not forget that many countries of the Indo-Pacific have suffered a history of colonialism, some of the wrinkles of which are still with us and still need to be ironed out. While doing so, and while moving ahead purposefully, we need to be mindful not to embrace constructs that themselves create dependencies and skewed arrangements. These concerns are particularly relevant as the Indo-Pacific region puts its mind to supply chain resilience and diversification. In the post-coronavirus, India is party to several such conversations. For example, it is working with its Japanese and Australian friends on the Supply Chain Resilience Initiative. We must not forget that many countries of the Indo-Pacific geography can perhaps be best described as a succession of semicircles. The innermost semicircle incorporates our closest neighbors. These are South Asian countries with whom we share the waters of the Indian Ocean, that have shared our civilizational and cultural heritage, and that, by way of proximity, inevitably share our joys and sorrows. The arc of the outer neighborhood covers the Gulf states to our west and Southwest Asia and the ASEAN countries to our east. In a sense, this too is a rediscovery of old maritime associations, but contemporary business and trade, energy and investment flows, and labor and skills mobility have added new dimensions. Economic currents in the United Arab Emirates or Singapore, for instance, are carefully monitored by millions of families in India. Moving further, India has created partnerships and mechanisms with countries, opportunities, concerns, and stakes of which intersect with our own. This is a broad sweep from the Pacific Islands to the archipelago of the Western Indian Ocean and off the eastern coast of Africa. Networks such as the Quad, with India, the United States, Japan, and Australia as participants, and the India-Japan-US, what we call JAIR, India-France-Australia, and India-Indonesia-Australia trilateral arrangements offer cases in point. Military and HADR exercises, whether bilateral or multi-country, open avenues. So does cooperation on the protection of global marine commons, as well as on issues such as illegal, unregulated, and unreported fishing, very damaging to the ocean's ecology. The Mauritius oil spill of August 2020 saw India and France responding together to assist local authorities. While such networks, coordination mechanisms, and complementarities have their utility, the centrality of ASEAN resonates with India's idea of the Indo-Pacific. By virtue of its location, its longevity, and its social and economic attainments, ASEAN has emerged as a platform where various interests can meet, interact, and rationalize differences. These qualities are not to be discounted, and it should be our collective endeavor to preserve them. However, it must also be acknowledged that institution formation in the Indo-Pacific is still at an incipient stage. It took the shock of 2 world wars in a generation for the Atlantic consensus to be formalized and institutionalized. It is possible that the after effects of the pandemic, the biggest disruption to the global system since the Second World War, could nurture similar approaches in the Indo-Pacific. Whatever the navigation map, the fact that the Indo-Pacific is the 21st century's locus of political and security concerns and competition, of growth and development, and of technology incubation and innovation is indisputable. That is why a country like Germany, physically distant but an economic stakeholder in the Indo-Pacific, has released a strategy for the region. After France and the Netherlands, it is the 3rd European country to do so. In India, we have noted with some satisfaction that our policy outlook has much in common with these documents. The UK, we hope and expect, will be next on the list, and too Pacific strategy. Given this country's characteristic wisdom and prodigious institutional memory, we hope too that the UK strategy will approximate India's own long-standing Indo-Pacific vision. I thank you, and I will be happy to answer questions.
Great. Well, thank you very much indeed, Foreign Secretary, for that extraordinary exposition of India's vision for the Indo-Pacific. May I, before we come on to questions, just remind our audience to raise your hands on Zoom or raise your electronic hands somehow, and so that we can be aware of your wish to ask a question. I'm going to turn first of all to Lord Howell, who's actually physically with us here at Policy Exchange, to ask the first question, if I may.
Well, thank you very much indeed, and thank you, Minister. That's extremely clear. I've no doubt at all that your thesis is right, that the Indo-Pacific is the strategic centre of the world of the new world now emerging. I don't think that's perceived by many Atlanticists, but it is a fact, the coming fact that we have to deal with. I'm going to ask, if I made a hard power question and a soft power or wise power question. The hard power question concerns the maritime scene, which you emphasised in your talks, and the question of whether international cooperation, and I'm thinking particularly of cooperation between this country you're now in and India, cannot be developed considerable range further. I'm actually myself connected with some projects in this area. When I say maritime cooperation, I mean the whole supply chain of the maritime operational effort, from shipbuilding, construction and weapons development right through to actual operational patrols and operational activity in the Indian Ocean area. Is this an area which you're interested in? Do you see some more cooperation coming? Do you see the benefits of it? On the soft power side, the world is, of course, connecting through a gigantic, mainly non-governmental pattern of soft power and connected power through every profession, the science, medicine, universities, education, and every other area. One of the huge transmission mechanisms of modern soft power happens to be the Commonwealth network, which only exists because of Jawaharlal Nehru's insistence that it should, that it is really an invention of Nehru. I don't think I heard you mention it in your speech, but does India appreciate that, as well as the hard power we all need to integrate on, we need to develop these soft power links at every level, and that one of the ways, not the only one, but one of the very, very effective ways in which this is happening is through the Commonwealth network. I'd like your comments on both those points. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Lord Howell. With regard to your first question on cooperation on maritime cooperation in the international domain, I think this is central to the Indo-Pacific concept. The Indo-Pacific concept encompasses the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. There are vast swaths of water bodies that unite all our countries in the Indo-Pacific. Maritime cooperation is an important part of that exercise. The issue of creating secure, resilient, safe and sustainable supply chains has been very much, I would say, topical in recent months in the wake of the COVID crisis. I am myself part of an Indo-Pacific grouping that consists of several countries, including that ranges from the United States to Australia on the other end, but that also includes Japan, Vietnam, South Korea, and other countries. And one of the issues that we've discussed at quite some length is the issue of how do we work on creating secure supply chains, how do we work on bringing our synergies together and our complementarities together. And I think maritime cooperation is one of those that figure very importantly in that. I think countries really have to provide the institutional framework, provide the policy guidance, and clearly the Indo-Pacific concept, as countries increasingly take on to that concept. There's greater traction for that concept. You will find that maritime cooperation and the possibility of making sure that there are networks that provide the commercial basis for that cooperation would come into play. In India, we have a fairly developed shipbreaking industry, but we also have a shipbuilding industry. We do require inputs in that regard from several countries, and there is a great amount of give and take that is involved in any international business today, or any international supply chain, and I think our countries need to sit down and work out how we can actually give practical shape to concrete areas of cooperation of the kind that you have mentioned. Coming down to the soft aspect of cooperation, and you mentioned the Commonwealth, and I do believe that the Commonwealth is a unique institution because it really brings together English-speaking countries, who were part of the British Empire, the erstwhile British Empire. But what is unique about the Commonwealth, I think, is that most of our countries are really within the Indo-Pacific zone, within Asia, within Africa, and also within the Pacific island area, which is Australia, New Zealand, etc. And I think the scope for cooperation in that regard is there. I think once more of our countries start working on what the Indo-Pacific represents, how they can get involved, I think taking it to the Commonwealth would be a logical corollary. And the Commonwealth is a natural organization through which we can take forward the Indo-Pacific concept. But I really would want to thank Lord Howell for raising these issues, because the Indo-Pacific is still very much an exercise in which we are all working together to define what it is, our own interpretations of what it is, and any ideas that could help us, I would say, come together on concrete areas of cooperation in this regard would be greatly appreciated.
Foreign Secretary, India has traditionally been highly reluctant to be dragooned into Western alliances of any sort, and has put a premium on its position of maintaining strategic autonomy. Has the heightened risk of conflict with your northern neighbour, China, changed that calculus? And what does India now think of the US's attempts to give India the label of ally?
Well, let me preface that by Johnson or Joe, if you permit
Please.
me, by saying that India is a country which has proud traditions. It is a country of 1.3 billion people. Its GDP is it's either the 5th or 6th largest in the world today. We are an aspiring nation. We have a young population. 70% of our population is below 40 years of age. So from our point of view, what we are, I think, more, I would say, comfortable with is working with our partners, working in association with other countries, be it the United Kingdom, be it France, Germany, Australia. The word ally suggests a certain connotation which is both military in nature and working, I would say, in a certain level of following a larger country in that regard. Now, our relations with the United States has progressed exponentially. I have had the advantage of serving in that country. Just before I came here, we had 3 major meetings that involved the United States. The first was a Quad meeting in Tokyo in the beginning of October. We had U.S. Deputy Secretary of State Steve Biegun, who came to India at the middle of the month. And we had the 2+2 ministerial dialogue at the end of the month. And what it made very evident was the length and breadth of our cooperation with what we call the comprehensive global strategic partnership is astounding. It ranges from defense to security, from technology to innovation, from people-to-people contacts. And I think it is really one of the unique relationships that has developed in the 21st century. And the same goes, I think Europe has become a very important partner. The fact that New Delhi felt I should be in Europe even while we are both fairly preoccupied with our respective COVID-19 situations, I think is a sense of the importance that we attach to the relationship with our friends in Europe. And of course, other partners, Australia, Japan, are very, very important elements of our economic, strategic, and people-to-people contacts as we move into the future. And clearly, COVID-19 has been a game changer in that sense. It's brought in enormous, not just geopolitical changes, but changes in the thinking of people, changes in a sense of both insecurity and a sense of what to do to deal with that, changes in terms of what the future holds. But most important, I think, is also in a sense of it has brought home the extent of vulnerabilities. If you allow me to digress slightly, the issue of supply chains came up earlier. In India, we found that in the wake of the crisis, the very health-related equipment that we needed, it was PPEs, face masks, test kits, ventilators, were in short supply, that we were highly dependent on our other trading partners to provide that equipment. The first phase of the pandemic was spent in scrambling to source this equipment. But what we did was that we innovated. We asked our industry, we asked automobile manufacturers to make ventilators, we asked people in the health sector to switch to test kits. I'm happy to say today that we are net expert. Not only can we supply these items to our country and our requirements, but we are able to supply these items to countries that need it. The other day, the Prime Minister said that when the crisis hit us, we had 16,000 ventilators in hospitals in India. We now propose to have 500,000 ventilators in a short while. So that's the extent of the change. But what it really means is that working with friends to develop supply chains that can ensure that you have reliable, secure, and sustainable ways of manufacturing, doing business, and providing for your essential requirements.
Foreign Secretary, we have a US election upon us today. Prime Minister Modi and President Trump have, over recent years, undeniably forged a very strong rapport. But at a time when India arguably needs flexibility to rebuild its fractured relationship with China, would you secretly rather that the next administration, whoever it is in the White House, avoids restricting India's options with high decibel, rather confrontational rhetoric about uniting against Chinese aggression?
Well, it is, I would say, it is not really incumbent on us to advise another country how it should view its external engagements. And I know that was not your question. Your question is, what do we prefer? And from our perspective, I would say that the US has been a country with whom, as I mentioned before, we've seen a phenomenal, I would say, relationship and comprehensive relationship. Just last month, we concluded the fourth of the four foundational agreements in the defense partnership with the United States. We started with what is LIMOA, the logistical agreement. There was COMCASA, which is the communications agreement, which is the BECA, which is the basic exchange communications agreement. All of these four, what does it mean in practical terms? It really means that these agreements give you the ability to communicate through platforms between the Indian and US forces. It enables a level of interoperability that was not there before. Today, we are doing joint exercises with the United States. We're doing more joint exercises with the United States than with any other country. But if you look at exercises like the Malabar exercises, we're talking about 4 countries coming together, exercising in areas like HADR. And this is, in our sense, a very, very great, let's say, in many senses, way of synergizing your resources, working together and giving confidence. And as far as how the US would project its own relationship both with us and with its other interlocutors is something that I might find difficult to comment on. But it needless to say that the relationship is one that we truly value.
Excellent. Our next question comes from Dr. Gerard Lyons, who's with us here at Policy Exchange. Gerard, would you introduce yourself and give your affiliation?
Thank you. Minister, thank you for an excellent talk. I'm Gerard Lyons. I'm a senior fellow here at Policy Exchange and an economist. You focus very much on the inclusivity of India's approach to the Indo-Pacific. Obviously, many questions focus on the role of China within the region, but I'd like to ask you about the economic perspective and two aspects to it. In terms of the domestic agenda, there's lots of competition for Indian funds. To what extent is the Indian government embracing the Indo-Pacific with increased allocation of resources and money? And how do you see that progressing in the future? And the second is, you mentioned Mr. Modi. He gave some excellent speeches, as you mentioned, in Singapore and in Bangkok. But it's interesting that you began by talking about East Africa as within the Indo-Pacific. Most other countries tend not to talk about East Africa in that context. Where do you see India's sphere of influence? Is it within ASEAN, or is it within East Africa, or do you see it as having, given your concentric circles, an ever-expanding concentric circle? Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lyons. The word, inclusive does come in because when our Prime Minister described what our vision of the Indo-Pacific was, he said a free, open, transparent, and inclusive Indo-Pacific. By inclusive, it also means it's not mutually exclusive from that point of view. Our approach has always been to cooperate, collaborate, and co-opt other states when it comes to our vision of the Indo-Pacific. As I said, we don't believe that it excludes anyone, but we are more than happy to include those who want to work on how we see the Indo-Pacific, a rules-based international order, one that promotes open connectivity, one that also upholds territorial integrity and sovereignty of states, of all states. There are important aspects to it, but the economic aspects that you mentioned are also very relevant, that we need to work with states, with our partners in the Indo-Pacific on areas that they're comfortable with. It could be connectivity. It's important to promote connectivity. Connectivity is key to economic growth and prosperity. But what we are really interested in ensuring that connectivity is on terms that we feel is based on an international rules-based order, which is based on an open, transparent system of bidding and a tender process that is in keeping with international norms, including those prescribed by the WTO. So the economic aspects of this is important. It is also important to support states. For example, in the wake of the COVID crisis, many of our countries, which are members of the G20, have come together and said that a moratorium on debt repayments is something that we are duty-bound to extend. In other words, we will reschedule the debts of all countries that actually have to repay on credit lines and other areas till the end of the year and perhaps beyond that. Economic partnerships also mean creating capacity, providing training, expertise, including in times of need. I did mention that we had sent rapid response teams to countries across the Western Indian Ocean. This is greatly appreciated because many countries, when hit with the crisis, didn't know how to react. They didn't know what it meant, what you need to do, what are the systems you need to put in place, what are the basic infrastructure you need to create to deal with the crisis, the dimensions of which most of us were completely unaware of. So the economic aspects are important. How can we work with states in areas that they're comfortable in taking forward the larger vision? And most of the states in the Indo-Pacific are developing countries. They need that assistance and they need that hand-holding that is an important component of that economic part of the Indo-Pacific vision. And of course, when we speak of the littoral states of Eastern Africa, it really, to us, indicates that we are talking about, the Indo-Pacific being from the west coast of the United States to the eastern coast of Africa. And as I mentioned in my address earlier, we don't look at this, as a zone that is as separate, whether it's the eastern part of the Straits of Malacca or the eastern coast of Africa, because these have been traditionally and historically for us areas of a great amount of, I would say, interaction. I would hesitate to use the word influence. It has a different connotation, but India has been present in these countries for centuries, if not millennia, through trade, through peaceful interactions, to cultural cooperation, whether it's Bali in Indonesia or whether it is in the Gulf in Oman. We have constantly been interacting historically, and this is the time in which we continue to extend that cooperation, so that this is something that becomes a zone of a focus, so to speak. You mentioned East Africa, and I would say that we have very strong links with Eastern Africa, not only because of the colonial past. Many of the countries, Tanzania, Kenya, Uganda, have been and part of the British Empire. South Africa is also a case in point. And we've, as a result, had a lot of people who've settled down in these countries as traders, merchants, but also indentured labor. South Africa, where I was posted, had the largest concentration of persons of Indian origin, 1 million people who were in the city of Durban. And from that perspective, these are people who want to keep in touch, who want to have a great amount of pride in the countries of their citizenship, but also have a great deal of interest in their countries of origin. And so we have ties that bind us culturally, historically, and I would say through the Indian Ocean geographically with Eastern Africa.
Thank you very much, Foreign Secretary. If you give us time for one more question, we have one from our audience online from Dia Chakravarti, who I'll turn to now. Please give your affiliation.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Mr. Secretary, for that very clear presentation. And may I start by wishing you a belated Shubh Vijaya.
Affiliation, Dia. Your affiliation?
And I am the Brexit editor at the Daily Telegraph. I do apologise.
Thank you.
So my specific interest is obviously in the sort of the Brexit talks going on at the moment professionally, and I know that you're going to embark on a sort of a Europe-wide tour as well. Many countries who deal with both and trade with both the EU and the UK have been quite vocal about what sort of a future relationship they want to see or they would wish for between these two blocks once we leave the transition period is over at the end of this year. I wondered, and it's quite an open question, what does India have in mind? Is there anything specific that you would like to see and your country would like to see coming out of these talks that we're being told both sides are working very hard for a solid conclusion?
But that's a very relevant question. My visit, I think, coincides with a very, very interesting time. We have both the COVID-19 situation and Brexit, which is very much in play. And both of these, in some senses, are game changers. They're game changers in terms of COVID because it is, I think, willy-nilly forced us to think very carefully on our geopolitical aspirations, on the way we conduct our relations with other countries, how we define the course of our future economic and political energies. So COVID-19 has been, in many senses, both economically and in terms of a health crisis, a major factor that has allowed us to, forced us to think. And at the same time, Brexit, of course, has meant that both Europe and the United Kingdom, to some extent, or to a large extent, have to look at redefining their relationships with their principal partners all over again. And we see enormous opportunity in both situations, and I'm saying opportunity in a very, very positive sense. In the case of Brexit, we would see this as a unique opportunity to redefine and reset our ties with the UK. I think the Foreign Secretary, Mr. Dominic Raab, had mentioned that we look to a transformational relationship with India over the next decade or two, and I think we are quite happy to work with our friends and partners in the UK to try and create the blueprint for that transformational relationship. And that relationship has to be comprehensive, of the kind that I mentioned with regard to the United States. We are looking at a relationship that is across the board. We have every reason to have that relationship. We have English-speaking countries. We have a common legacy. We have today a living bridge in the form of 1.6 million British citizens of Indian origin. We have complementarities and similarities, synergies in our economies. There is no reason why our two countries can't today reach a stage of takeoff. And we also have today a political dispensation in both our countries that want to take that relationship to that next important step forward. And of course, COVID-19, the Indo-Pacific is all about looking at what are your options, what are your focus points, whom do you want to work with, cooperate with, trade with, do business with, and these are important questions before all of us, and we need to very carefully analyze those and see where there are positive-looking opportunities. We would like the UK to come in as a major investor and innovation partner. We would also like to work with you. We talked about shipbuilding, we talked about maritime cooperation, we talked about a range of activities in the digital and cyber age, which was not even possible to conceive earlier. So I just to summarize your question, Dia, is that we are looking really at cooperation across the board. I think it's our endeavor to provide a plan that would, a roadmap that would take us to that stage. We have every possible encouragement from the leadership, because I know that when the Prime Minister spoke to Prime Minister Boris Johnson earlier this year, they both decided that let's move forward, let's take the relationship. This is a unique opportunity, and we are very happy to partner you in this endeavor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Foreign Secretary. You've been exceptionally generous with your time, and we've greatly benefited from your exposition of your vision for the Indo-Pacific and of the future of the UK-India relationship. You'll have no shortage of people in government wanting to help take this relationship to the next level to ensure it fulfills its potential in the years to come. Thank you once again for coming to Policy Exchange and being with us this afternoon. Thank you.
And thank you, Joe.
Thank you.